All right, now I'm going to ask Bob Tembekjian to come on up. Bob is going to do the honors of introducing our chief judge. Bob is well known in the Armenian community for his writings and lectures on the Armenian Genocide and growing up Armenian. To the judiciary, he's best known as the administrator and counsel of the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Bob is a graduate of Syracuse University, the Fordham University School of Law, and Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is a past recipient of the Armenian Bar Association's Public Servants Award. Bob.
And it is not true that my staff is taking down license plates in front of the Whale Club. To those who hoped we might be hearing or nearing the end of the program, this is an Armenian event. We're just getting started. Congratulations to my old friend Burj Satrakian for a lifetime of philanthropic service on behalf of Armenians both in the homeland and in diaspora. Armenia is as much a state of mind as a physical place, and Burj has done more than anyone to keep both alive and thriving. Whenever I'm in a place such as this, symbolizing privilege and acceptance, I think of my grandparents who survived the Armenian Genocide and came to the United States illegally when immigration quotas were more restricted than the hopes and dreams of the uprooted. I think also of the spectacular metaphoric journey that more than 100 years later could lead the grandson of undocumented Armenians to a rostrum at the Yale Club about to introduce a fellow Harvard alum. This may be a first for both of us. Rowan Wilson is no stranger to important firsts. In 1991, for example, he became the first ever partner of color at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, a law firm founded in 1819. And as we all know, he broke a similar barrier upon becoming Chief Judge of New York. He is the first who is from California. Oh, come on. The man just keeps breaking barriers. Chief Judge Wilson is the 7th Chief Judge before whom I've had the privilege to argue, dating back to Lawrence Cook in 1983 while you were still in law school, Chief, and I'm told had a little more hair. Arguing before you last year, I had the disquieting realization that I was not only older than you and all the other judges of the court, I was older than everyone else in the room. In fact, I've been around so long, I'm now ineligible to join you on the Court of Appeals, which has a mandatory retirement age of 70. This puts me in a very awkward point in my professional career. I'm too old to serve on the New York bench, but too young to be President of the United States. Arguing before you is unlike arguing before anyone else. Though we may only have 15 minutes in court, my office prepares with hour-long moots. But we cover more than the facts in the applicable law. Prepping for you, we study Shakespearean sonnets and tragedies, Lerner and Lowe musicals, Babar the Elephant. If you've read the Chief's opinions, you know what I'm talking about. In my most recent appearance at the court, he asked me if I was acquainted with The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Fortunately, I had read the story in high school, though for a moment I thought I was taking an AP exam again. The Chief's erudition, sometimes whimsical, but always purposeful, has, I think, deep roots. His parents were educators who met at college in Boston. His mother was totally blind. And as the eldest of 3 children, young Rowan was her reader for anything not in Braille, from soup cans to newspapers, perhaps his own bedtime stories. I'm sure he learned to avoid the temptation when distinguishing between her $1 and $5 bills, folding them differently so she could tell the difference on her own. When his family moved to California and his mother pursued her PhD at Berkeley, his reading list was elevated to academic treatises, all before he was 12 years old, which is when his mother achieved her doctorate. These formative experiences likely contributed, that is, he was 12 years old, not his mother was 12 years old. These formative experiences likely contributed not only to his curiosity and the breadth of his future scholarship, but to the abiding sense of empathy and service that is evident to even those who know him casually. He carried his mother's drive to obtain his own undergraduate and law degrees at Harvard, to clerking for the Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, to Cravath, where despite an active litigation practice, nearly 20% of his time was spent on pro bono projects, to active engagement with such organizations as the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Neighborhood Defender Services, to now the highest position in the New York legal system. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the co-honoree tonight of the Armenian Bar Association Public Service Award, the Chief Judge of New York, Rowan D. Wilson.
Thank you, everyone, and good evening. I'm not sure why I have 2 knives up here. Put them out of harm's way. Let me begin by thanking Bob Convection for his warm introduction and for also proposing me as a possible recipient of the Public Servants Award. I should say I hate being on camera, particularly on film, but this is one occasion where I'm glad I'm being filmed, because if I ever get into ethical trouble, I'm subpoenaing the videotape for Bob's remarks and resting my case. My heartfelt thanks also go to the Armenian Bar Association for this tremendous award. And a little bit of a digression here. A couple days ago, my 13-year-old daughter said, "Dad, what are you going to do with all these trophies and awards?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And she said, "Well, can I sell some of them?" And I said, "Well, I don't think there's any market for any of these. But, you know, if I get to the point where I got too many of them, you can sell them." So this one is perhaps the only one that anyone would pay anything for, because it is beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. And it's the only one I'm not going to let her sell. So the Armenian Bar Association has been involved in important educational and advocacy work since its founding 35 years ago, and it's become a pillar of the tight-knit community of Armenian Americans. I'm immensely honored to be with you all and to have the opportunity to address you. After dinner speeches are supposed to be light and brief, but Bob advised me that the custom for this dinner is serious and long. I'm actually not kidding, and I had dinner in Syracuse a couple weeks ago, organized by Judge Karolinus. So another digression here. So I think this is true. I've at least heard it from several people, that there was some sort of unwritten rule of the courts, and maybe some of the other judges here can confirm or deny this, that if you were the president of one of the judicial associations, you were automatically disqualified from an administrative position because you weren't then a loyal soldier or something like that. You were representing the judges instead of the administration. I see Judge Wooten nodding a little bit. So Judge Karolinus was the president of the New York Supreme Court Justice Association, and Chief Judge, Administrative Judge Zayas and I knew she was the absolute right person to be the administrative judge for the 5th Judicial District. And besides that, if that was a rule, that's a silly rule because it's in inverse. The people in whom the expression was used earlier, the boots on the ground judges have the faith in, are exactly the people who should be the administrators, right? That's the way it should work. It should be the people who are doing the work telling us, here's our representative. I can't, I wish you had been there when Judge Karolinus, without much notice to me, maybe any notice to me, had me speak in front of a group of 100 people there. And I made some remarks and I thought I was done. And then she took me to another room, there were another 100 people. And this happened, and I gotta tell you, everybody there was so warm. And they kept saying, this is the happiest place in the court system. And by the end of the day, I kind of thought, they're probably right. And you know who it's because of? It's because of Judge Karolinus. So I do have a lot of experience with long and serious writings, but not so much with long and serious after-dinner speeches. So if I fall short, you'll have to forgive me, but I'm making my best attempt. When I was young, my family didn't watch much TV. Mr. Tembection, Bob Tembection, has explained one of the reasons, which is that my mom couldn't see. That didn't stop her from listening to TV programs and from us explaining this to her, but we just didn't watch very much TV. But one program we regularly watched was Disney's Wonderful World of Color, which aired on Sunday evenings. Some of you probably remember it. We didn't actually have a color TV. I didn't understand the irony at the time, but now it's kind of funny. I do remember that lots of the programming that was on it, and one was a 1955 movie. I wasn't alive in '55, but they would replay these things, called King of the Wild Frontier. And it was a movie glorifying Davy Crockett, an American folk hero, frontiersman, soldier, and politician from the turn of the 19th century. Perhaps because my parents were generally skeptics and they taught us to be skeptical of anything we heard, perhaps because they were liberal, or perhaps just because I'd read too much by the time I was watching this, that movie always struck me really badly. The film's theme song began by announcing that 3-year-old Davy Crockett killed a bear, and went on to portray him as fighting single-handedly, and I quote, in the Injun War till the Creek were whipped and peace was restored. I wondered even then why I was listening to a cheery, bouncy song about killing bears and Native Americans. In his autobiography, entitled Narrative of the Life of David Crockett, written by himself, he recounts his participation in the Battle of Tallahatchie against the Creek Nation in 1813. And I quote, I saw some warriors run into a house until I counted 46 of them. We pursued them until we got near the house. We now shot them like dogs and then set the house on fire and burned it up with the 46 warriors in it. I recollect seeing a boy who was shot down near the house. His arm and thigh was broken, and he was so near the burning house that the grease was stewing out of him. In this situation, he was still trying to crawl along, but not a murmur escaped him, though he was only about 12 years old. As you can tell from this passage, and I've left out the goriest details, this was not a battle, it was a massacre. 186 members of the Creek Nation, including women and children, were murdered. The American militia suffered 5 casualties. The onslaught evoked a series of treaties in which the Creek Nation ceded its lands to the United States. When European colonists arrived in the Americas, historians estimate there were over 15 million indigenous Americans living here. By 1900, that population had been decimated to an estimated 238,000. The numbers alone are staggering and painful to think about. And they're even more so when we think about the violence and carnage that the colonists subjected the indigenous Americans to, with the goal of eradicating their cultures and nations. I imagined that Disney had rendered the film unavailable, but when I checked Disney Plus a couple days ago, I found it was still available. I was actually glad to see that I was mistaken, because it was preceded by a note that reads, this program includes negative depictions and/or mistreatment of people or cultures. These stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. Rather than remove this content, we want to acknowledge its harmful impact, learn from it, and spark conversations to create a more inclusive future together. It is only recently that our society has begun to realize the importance of acknowledging the wrongs of our own past instead of trying to bury or erase them. And you can see that at tension today. Some of you have probably been to an event that begins with a land acknowledgement, a recognition of the indigenous peoples that inhabited and stewarded the land before it was taken from them. Such an acknowledgement can be uncomfortable. It makes its listeners to sit with the historical wrong and to keep learning and adjusting their own relationship with history. Discomfort, learning, adjusting, that's when growth and change happen. At the same time, we are adopting customs like land acknowledgements. We are melting down the statues of Confederate generals. These statues, mostly erected during the Jim Crow era to glorify white supremacist values of the Confederacy, are painful, hateful symbols. But if we just destroy them, how can we sit with our discomfort, learn, adjust, heal, and move forward? Erasing history serves no one. As the poet Rumi said, "The wound is where the light enters you." April is the first full month when those of us living in the northern hemisphere have more light than darkness. Yet another poet, T.S. Eliot, offered that April is the cruelest month. Although Eliot was most certainly not thinking of this, April is the month in which, you all know, we commemorate the victims of the Armenian Genocide, an unspeakably painful time in human history that claimed the lives of more than 1.5 million Armenians. For Armenians, April must seem cruel, and especially so this year, with unabated, unbearably painful news of violence and displacement around the world, including of the ongoing suffering and conflict in Artsakh. Although the Armenian Genocide took place more than a century ago, it was only in 2021 that President Biden broke with America's usual euphemisms and called the event what it was, a genocide. That acknowledgement was generations overdue, and it is my deep hope that the American Armenian community has experienced some measure of peace and healing because of it. I'm also hopeful that the President's decision to call the genocide what it was, like the recognition of indigenous peoples' inhabitation of our land and disclaimers like Disney's, reflect the start of an understanding that the words we use matter greatly. They can be used to distort viciously or to describe even painful events truthfully as a way to address the past, repair it, and move forward with greater empathy for understanding of others. I have 3 reflections that I'd like to share with you. The first is about the timing of President Biden's recognition. It is natural and appropriate to feel disappointed by and betrayed by the succession of our leaders who prioritize political and military interests over the truth, or to feel resentful at just how long it took for the recognition to take place. But I'm an optimist, and my personal takeaways are twofold. First, it happened. And second, it happened because of this community. People often say that time heals all wounds or good things come to those who wait. I don't believe that. President Biden's recognition was not inevitable, and it was not due to the mere passage of time. Instead, it was because of the unceasing efforts of those who advocated for federal recognition for decades, who insisted that we cannot begin to heal if we don't first identify and bandage our wounds. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless work of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. Rather than giving in to the forces of social stagnation, rather than accepting the status quo, the Armenian American community did not grow weary. It lobbied continually for our government to recognize a full and just account of their motherland's history. It is my firm belief that this hard work of those seeking justice will always pay off in the end. Change and progress are always possible, even if they do not come as quickly as we want them to. I remind myself of this and of the hard-fought justice we have achieved on many fronts even over the course of my own lifetime, when the path may appear long and dark. My second reflection is that in the wake of the federal government's historic recognition, many have decried it as merely a symbolic gesture. They would have us believe, with so much time passed, when the perpetrator's long gone, what does it matter what we call it? You hear that same sentiment in people who protest that slavery was a long time ago, or people today have nothing to do with it, or say things like Native Americans should be happy that they have casinos. I, like I'm sure everyone in this room, disagrees with that view vehemently. Words matter. And words especially matter when we're talking about history. In the musical Wicked, and I don't want to disappoint Bob, the wizard explains to the supposedly wicked witch Elphaba why, despite being one of a dime a dozen mediocrities, he is called the Wonderful Wizard, and why he is respected, worshipped even, by the people of Oz. He tells her, "Where I'm from, we believe all sorts of things that aren't true. We call it history. A man's a traitor or a liberator, a rich man's a thief or philanthropist. Is one a crusader or ruthless invader? It's all in which label is able to persist. When we fail to use accurate labels to describe our history, it gives power to violent, brutal persecutors, both past and prospective. It allows perpetrators to control the historical narrative, to be remembered and revered as crusaders rather than invaders. And it signals to those who would seek to rule by force and violence that as long as they control the narrative, they can commit crimes against humanity with impunity. This is not a theoretical danger. In August 1939, Hitler gave a speech to his high-ranking military leaders, commanding them to be brutal and merciless and violent against men, women, and children in their imminent invasion of Poland. Perhaps to reassure his forces that there would be no lasting consequences for such brutality, Hitler reportedly concluded the speech by saying, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" By calling things by their names, by being honest with ourselves about our history, it removes impunity, denial, and distortion from the playbook. It ensures we are all authors of our collective history, and it helps to have the language to identify and prevent future horrors. My final reflection is the following. At the same time we have made strides in addressing our mischaracterization of certain historical events, we are sliding precipitously into the misuse of words when describing the present. Both in public and private discourse, we have become freer in throwing around words without regard for their truth. Worse still, technology advanced to the point where instead of allowing us to carefully check facts before making pronouncements, many are using it to amplify false or misleading information or to create deep fakes used to validate falsehoods. Although the technology is new, the use of words without regard for the truth, or indeed without the objective of with the objective of altering the truth, is ancient. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides wrote the following: "To fit with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. If an opponent made a reasonable speech, the party in power, so far from giving it a generous reception, took every precaution to see that it had no practical effect. And if pacts of mutual security were made, they were entered into by the two parties only to meet some temporary difficulty and remained in force only so long as there was no other weapon available. And indeed, most people are more ready to call villainy cleverness than simple-mindedness honesty. They are proud of the first quality and ashamed of the second." To me, that sounds eerily familiar. We find ourselves today fighting that same war, the war to make sure the words we speak represent the truth. At the core, that is what the law is about: the use of words to determine and speak the truth. Just as Dr. King observed, time can be used for good or ill, the same is true of words. Your efforts to compel the truthful recognition of the Armenian Genocide for what it was is a battle victory, but it will take continued vigilance and effort by all of us to win the war for the truth. Thank you all for this wonderful work.
Now, the gift that you won't let be sold.
not being solved.
Surin.
Okay, I'm done with my blind eyes. Let me read this inscription on this plaque. The Armenian Bar Association, on the occasion of its Public Servants Dinner 2024, proudly acknowledges the Honorable Rowan D. Wilson, Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals of the State of New York, in recognition of your dedication and commitment at the highest levels to public service and legal excellence, and your promotion of diversity, inclusion, and justice for all.